So, traditional Jewish, Christian, or Muslim.
Hi, Preston.
Hi, Katie.
And welcome you
to the Holy Watermelon Podcast.
Today's a big one.
Yeah.
It's a big one.
I mean, we say big. There's an awful lot of Christians in this world.
I mean, it's the biggest.
Is it numerically actually the biggest?
It is.
Okay.
And followed closely by Islam.
Right.
Which is 2 weeks from now.
We'll be talking about many, many religions as we keep going through this path of exploring the Western and Eastern traditions. A label which, of course, you'll remember I don't like.
We don't like it.
All right.
So, Christianity, Mr. Christian. I feel like you are the more experienced of the two of us in this topic.
I have plenty of experience with
first-hand
Christianity.
experience for once.
Yes, I am a Christian theology instructor. I have been for quite a long time.
You are a Christian?
I'm a Christian. I've been involved with Christian community for the last 18 years. 19 years.
Whoa.
It's been 19 years. That's kind of weird. I've been teaching theology for a while. That's the field in which I got my degree. It's Christian theology and religious studies. Of course, they're two different things, but they have mixed very well for my studies, which is a lot of fun. And it is a really complicated subject to try and cram into an episode of our podcast.
Yeah, I guess we'll see how long we talk for. I've said this before. This might be a two-parter, and it never has been yet. So
we'll see.
We'll see. I think we've done a pretty good job in planning that this will be a very broad
but relatively concise
summary of beliefs and practices and history. And of course, I know some of the episodes we have planned going further, we'll dive into more specific areas of Christianity. And but if you have any suggestions or recommendations, please drop us a line on Facebook, Instagram, or our email. All of them are holywatermelonpod@gmail.com for the email, and handles are holywatermelonpod. And we'd love to hear your suggestions and feedback for episodes.
Absolutely. If we can make this a discussion that involves your voices in addition to ours, we're going to enjoy our company a lot better.
So I think it's fair to say Christianity has a firmer start date than Judaism.
Yeah.
Judaism kind of just more from older religions.
It definitely looks that way from pretty much every perspective.
Whereas...
And the tricky thing is we don't have any sure day on when Moses is supposed to have been born.
Well, and I mean, that's 4,000 years ago. We're really starting to push it at that point. But Christianity has this guy named JC.
Yeah.
So that's a starting point.
Yeah. Josh, who was later surnamed Oily Josh, was born approximately 2,020 years ago. It's kind of convenient that we have a calendar that's based on the supposed time of his birth. Of course, there's loads of discussion on why that's not a very good estimation, why people think it's off.
Is it because we've changed our calendars?
No.
Oh.
There's a good handful of scholars who are on one particular side of the argument say that Jesus was born probably 4 BC, 4 years earlier than what is typically commonly expected. This number is primarily driven by the chronology and the timing of the death of Herod the Great. The story of Matthew says that Herod the Great was so worried about this rising up of the king of the Jews that he had all the babies killed. And there's already some historical issues here. But for that story to be true about Jesus, then Jesus had to have been born around 4 BC because Herod died a few years before 1 AD. So, which is the first year of our Lord, there's no year zero. It's not the year after the birth and year before. It's year before and then the year of.
So 1 and 1.
Yep. Calendars are tricky. There's usually not 0 years in calendars. I'm not aware of a calendar that has a 0 year, but I'm also allowing myself to get easily distracted from a far more interesting topic. So I could go on for a whole hour on just the topic of the timing of when Jesus was born. I don't happen to believe that part of the story in the first few chapters of Matthew that say anything about King Herod. Popular Jewish literature of the time attributes a very similar story to Abraham. And the way things go in Judaic literature is if you want somebody to look holy or to appear to fill any of the same roles as another former great leader, you tell the exact same story about them.
Oh.
And so, as I think we talked about before, there's not a whole lot about the story of Jesus that the first telling of that happening was to Jesus.
Yes.
This is definitely an example of that problem. Jesus, his story really begins with the important stuff when he was about 30 years old. Described as his cousin, good old John the Baptist, and then immediately starts teaching and beginning his life as a rabbi. And then tells everybody loads of things about how to be a good person, be a good neighbor, be a good friend, and then also says a few things that really offend an awful lot of people and gets killed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Short and sweet.
Right? And so the Christian religion, when it exactly started, it's pretty easy to say Jesus having students as a rabbi in approximately 30 AD is a fairly sound beginning.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely a completely different organization at that point than there is 100 years later, or even 10 years later. Let's be real. The churches established by the apostles are structurally very different and can't really be said to be the same church that Jesus started, but the doctrines and the dogma and the creeds and beliefs stem from the mortal ministry of Jesus and the miracles that he did to convince people that he was worth listening to. He fed an awful lot of people, whether they were rich or poor. He warned the rich that they're not going to go to heaven. This is very offensive to people in America who feel that you can't possibly have God's favor unless you are rich. It's a problem.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of wealthy churches out there, so that's probably a problem too.
Yeah, Christianity's tricky.
Yeah.
But yeah, it started with a guy. I don't think it's fair to just call him a guy who was in the Middle East. He was a Jew. He grew up in the Pharisaic tradition. He taught in the same way that all of the Pharisaic rabbis around him did. And this is very evident when reading the Bible. And if you have any familiarity with how the rabbis have argued, if you read the Talmud or the Mishnah in general, there's loads of arguing between people who have an education. It's almost like what we see today in university situations where you have to defend your thesis to be considered a doctor. Not wildly different. And that's who Jesus was as a mortal person, was a person who argued an awful lot.
Well, we talked about this last episode that the Jewish community is waiting for the Messiah to come. Christians believe the Messiah has come. It was Jesus. Jesus is the son of David that's going to rebuild the temple. And
yep. And he didn't build anything as far as we have any record.
Maybe a table. He was a carpenter.
See, that's actually also a tricky thing. He might not have been a carpenter.
He didn't build a table?
Though that is a very heartwarming scene in The Passion of the Christ, seeing him build a table and having it high up, being all prophetic that we're going to sit up here one day instead of these low tables where we're chilling out on our sides. This isn't even a visual medium. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, Preston's like leading and miming all of this, just so everyone knows. He's really into this.
I talk with my hands and I draw things, and One day we'll actually just straight up have a show
We'll
that's
get a
live
YouTube
where
channel.
people can see us.
Yeah.
That'll be great. In the meantime, I'm just miming for your entertainment, I
like
guess,
it.
Katie.
I'm happy.
So there's no real evidence that Jesus was a carpenter at all. There's a word that has occasionally been translated as carpenter in the New Testament that's used to describe Jesus. And later in Latin, they doubled down and committed, totally, Jesus was a carpenter. And that's where that tradition comes from. The Greek word translates more fairly to craftsman. It's a broader word. And if Jesus was in fact from the town that we now call Nazareth, it wasn't called Nazareth when Jesus was born, according to all of the historians and archaeologists that we found. If he was from that town, it would make a lot more sense that he was actually a stonecutter.
Mm-hmm.
So slightly more likely that he would have actually built something that was meant to endure like a temple, but probably didn't build a temple.
Yet.
Right. Both, just as the Jews are waiting for the Messiah to come, the Christians are waiting for him to come again. And the plan is that the temple will then be rebuilt.
I don't know what's with all this procrastination.
Right? We just wait. We sit and wait, and we hope for the best. And some of us try not to be dicks in the meantime.
So the Christians have their Bible.
Oh, you're already on rocky ground.
Okay. We're going to do a full Bible episode, so...
But I'll give a quick summary.
Okay.
So we talked before in the last episode that the Jews have the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. Christians have the Christian New Testament, sometimes called the Greek Bible or the Greek New Testament. Luckily, the Catholic Church managed to nail down a solid 27 texts that make up the New Testament, and everybody splintered off after that point. So all Christians pretty much agree on the 27 books of the Bible. Luther wasn't too fond on the Epistle of James. There's loads of people who would like to write off the Revelation of John. But for the most part, the canon is those 27 texts. The Old Testament, which I've mentioned before, I like to call the Hebrew Bible when it's appropriate, as much as I can remember to do so. The Old Testament is a different thing than the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible is 39 books in the Christian tradition. The number is smaller in the Hebrew tradition. They've combined a few books. They've got a bunch of books got split in half when they translated them into Greek in the handful of centuries of the former era, the before Christ times. And so the number got expanded a little bit, but also the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, translated in Egypt by Jews who spoke Greek and could read and write it. They included a lot more books than are included in the newer Masoretic text of the Tanakh. And so the Orthodox Christians, Russians, Ukrainians, the Eastern Orthodox collection
There's
of
also
churches.
a Asian Orthodox.
There is.
Which I don't know a lot about, but I just thought it was important to mention that there's the Eastern European.
And then there's
and
further
Asian.
east. Yeah.
Even further east, yeah.
There's so many different churches and blocks of churches within the umbrella of Christianity that there's not one thing that you can say about Christianity and their doctrines or their beliefs or their creeds that is correct if you want to make it universal, except for we believe in Jesus.
I think the only thing I remember hearing is that Jesus is the Son of God.
Yes.
Is what makes you a
That's
Christian.
the thing.
Because then you get religious scholars who believe in a historical Jesus. That doesn't make them Christian.
Right.
So the lowest common denominator of Christianity is that
Jesus
Jesus is the Son of God. And we'll dive into this at another point. But like, I'm a firm believer that if you think Jesus is the Son of God, you're a Christian, even if you're Westboro Baptist Church
Even if
and
you're
you
just
have
the
a
worst kind of Christian.
garbage doctrine, you are a Christian. And and same thing for Islam. If you believe that Muhammad is the prophet and you're part of ISIS, then yeah, you're still a Muslim. You're a bad Muslim, but you're still a Muslim. And I think that's an important conversation to have in the world of moderation, and that these groups have to moderate themselves. If you're a Christian, you think Westboro Baptist Church is bad, you need to be having those conversations in your congregation or in your home and with your community that, this, yes, they're Christian, but this is not acceptable way to be. Anyway, sorry, that was a little soapbox I got on. I'm going to step down now.
All right. It's okay to have soapbox moments. That was really, really normal, say 200 years ago, for Christian preachers to actually jump up on a soapbox and shout at people.
It's still,
it still happens here. Sometimes when we go downtown, definitely see dudes on soapboxes shouting at each other. And it's not the way Jesus taught at all. Sometimes he had to lift his voice to be heard by what is reported to be huge numbers of people. I feel like 5,000 people listening to Jesus at any given time seems unrealistic. I feel like it's being artificially inflated.
Yeah.
Right? Well, even if you had, as was sometimes practiced, a person speaking and then people just at the cusp of hearing range, they would shout to the next people down, which would probably also be distracting to the dude in the middle.
But also telephone?
Right? You got problems.
Telephone?
It causes some serious problems. That things would be left out, things would be reworded in a way that can be very problematic. 2,000 years of Christianity has shown us that pretty effectively. There's a lot. Got distracted from what I wanted to say about the Bible. So there was this Bible that was produced by Jewish scholars in Egypt, putting the Bible into Greek. They included a lot more books than is included in the Masorah. So the Greek Orthodox Church has them as part of the canon. The Septuagint includes a whole bunch of extra books. Their Bible is longer. And the Catholics generally don't have it in the main text of their Bible. We have the word apocrypha primarily in our language today because of the title of these books as a group, also called Deuterocanon. They're it's in the canon, but it's second class kind of deal. So they're books that are recognized, but they're not authoritative. And some of them are nifty books, and some of them are really cool stories that it's just as valid as other parts of the Bible. And some of them are that's a good reason you cut that.
Just to backtrack a bit.
Doing it more. Because I had to backtrack to get to the Bible thing.
Oh, so we're just
we're all over the place.
We're going in circles. Christianity has dozens, if not hundreds, of denominations, but I did want to let our congregant know that Christianity can be broken down into three big ones, which then break down further. So you have Orthodox Christianity, you have Catholicism, and then you have Protestantism, which we'll get into in more detail. And
you have smaller groups that don't really fit into those categories, but they're smaller groups. That's the way that goes.
Yeah, those are, and so chronologically, it sort of starts with Orthodox. Starts with Catholicism. I feel like those are right around the same time. Protestantism is the newest one, and it comes out of Catholicism, which we'll get to, but Preston's going to jump in and correct me.
Yeah. So Christianity has never been properly united. Even biblical, the first decades of Christianity, Peter and Paul, who for some reason share a feast day.
But they hate each other.
I wouldn't say they hate each other. They disagreed an awful lot on some pretty high-profile topics.
Aren't they both there?
Paul was, far as we know, never a witness to anything that Jesus did while he was alive. But the story is that while he was off persecuting Christians for being terrible Jews, he was struck with a vision and went blind briefly and saw Jesus say, "Stop being a dick. Here I am. Become a Christian. And then he did. And he quickly led.
Jesus called me a dick.
Right? Book of Mormon musical, some good fun. And so Paul, after having seen Jesus, went and hung out with the Christians and quickly rose to leadership and wrote basically half of the New Testament. And famously disagreed with Peter on a bunch of things, called Peter out on being a bad Jew sometimes, when Peter was like, I'm not so worried about being a Jew. I'm a Christian.
I'm a Christian now.
Peter has some struggles in his life. Paul has struggles in his.
Don't we all?
Right? And they did agree on a good handful of important things, but they're more famously celebrated for disagreeing. And there's loads of other factions in Christianity that became visible very quickly before the New Testament was done being written. You've got these groups who believe some things that are condemned by the leadership of the church.
Is it the Gnostics? They believe some weird shit.
So there's not one cohesive group of these are the Gnostics either, but Gnostic belief definitely crept into Christianity and caused some problems for a lot of people. And yeah, a pretty decent example. And then when all of the apostles were gone, mostly by being brutally murdered.
Martyred, Preston.
Yes, martyred. They refused to deny what they had taught, and that's the credit we get. We give them a slightly cooler title. They started using the word Catholic for the most broadly accepted tenets of the faith, Catholic meaning universal. And Orthodox as a word probably was used around then realistically as a Greek word, which literally just means right teachings. The Catholic Church uses orthodoxy.
I remember why I think orthodoxy comes first.
Yeah.
Which is clearly now incorrect, but I always thought it came first because in Orthodox tradition, so I think still in Ukrainian and Greek Orthodox, the Mass is done with actual bread and actual wine. And I believe they don't believe in transubstantiation. So it's a metaphor that the bread is the body of Christ and the wine is the blood. Whereas Catholics believe in transubstantiation, where it literally turns into the body. You're literally eating the flesh and blood.
If you show up to Mass, you're a cannibal.
Yes. And I remember hearing a story is that the reason that Catholics use the Eucharist, the cracker, is because, so when you break bread, crumbs are made. And if you're having Mass in a church, you know, there could be birds or rats
mice.
or church mice, and they're obviously picking up the crumbs. And the Catholics think it's like sacrilegious for a mouse to have the body of Christ in him. So that's why in my brain I was like, well, the bread and wine would have come first, and then it innovated into the Eucharist cracker.
I hadn't heard that, but it does make sense in that context.
So that's why in my brain orthodoxy came first.
Sure.
Because they didn't give a shit and then they got stricter. But so that was my reasoning why I said what I said. I said what I said. But thank you for correcting me. And fun fact for you.
Yeah, so Orthodoxy and Catholicism weren't really titles that were used a whole lot until maybe a little less than 1,000 years ago. And Catholic would have been used more than Orthodox as describing the church, which would have been the Christian church until the big split of, going from memory, I'm going to say 1134 AD. And I really hope I remembered that right.
Does anyone
I feel
care
like I studied pretty hard. I don't like focusing on dates because I don't think you guys care.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Approximately.
About 1,000 years ago, there was this huge split between a whole bunch of Christians, and the split mostly ended up being the leadership of East versus the leadership of West. Ultimately down to a word. One word in Latin, and an awful lot of argument about that word, caused the big split. And that word is based on my pronunciation of Latin, which people can argue but can't prove anything, is filioque, which is and the Son, which out of context is meaningless. But when talking about the Holy Ghost in the Trinitarian Godhead that is the God of Christianity, the Holy Ghost is said to come from the Father, and those in the West added, and the Son. And the folks out East are like, no, that's not cool. That's not right. We don't believe that, and you can't make us add it. And if you want to start a fight over it, bye.
Bye, Felicia.
And so the guys on the East side and the West side just excommunicated each other and said, we're splitting the church up. And
that's not the first time it's going to happen. Spoiler alert!
So many similar things have happened over and over again. It's interesting. Like we talked about in Judaism, that there's the major groups within Judaism that we look at are, the Orthodox, conservative, and liberal, where it's not wildly different beliefs. They just
sort of level of
practice, almost.
As
mostly
level of commitment, but that's not fair either, really.
Yeah, because every discussion on theology is different from rabbi to rabbi anyway, even within the liberals, within the Orthodox, within any given group, which is nice that you can actually have those discussions. It's so much easier to talk religion to a Jew than to a Christian.
I believe that.
In Christianity, there's huge fights over almost every single point of doctrine. And in an awful lot of those instances, a new church pops up.
Mm-hmm.
That gets really frustrating. So we had that huge split after a decent universality of Christianity for many centuries. And then we went a few hundred years more without any really big splits. And then in the 1500s, things got really messy, really, really fast. Europe started falling apart and splintering really bad as far as Christianity goes. We have reformers like Martin Luther, who's like, you guys have a lot of issues. I noticed this one thing, spent a lot of time studying. Here's a list of 95 things you guys need to get figured out and change.
And there's also a time there was like 3 popes.
Oh,
so even there was the division in the...
There's definitely always been questioning authority. That hasn't been too big of a problem. I mean, it definitely causes issues that I want to talk about a little bit later on, after I deal with the splintering bit. Yeah. Martin Luther, if you know much about him, you're either a fan or you're not, and that's fine. He put a lot of work into trying to make the church better. And that itself sounds pretty laudable. And there's actually a pretty decent movie telling this story, starring Joseph Fiennes, I think is how you pronounce his name.
Yeah.
I really enjoy the movie. It's got a bunch of other big stars in it. It's a lot of fun. A little bit of a downer, but it ends on a nice note. I've been told that Martin never left the Catholic Church, but...
I thought he was considered a heretic.
He was definitely, like, going to trials all the time for excommunication, like, don't cut me off from the church. But that's different than leaving the church.
That's true.
His relationship with the church was rocky from actually pretty much the beginning of him teaching at the university, and then only got worse as he started teaching against things that the Pope was doing. Causing problems, that's the thing. And a similar sort of thing, about the same century, England had a fun little issue with King Henry, who really just
wanted to fuck a lot of women.
I mean, it's easy to say that that's what the problem was.
But he was king, so he didn't need to.
Well, okay, he was king. You have an awful lot of power as king. He also had an impotency problem. So, and that's not published nearly enough.
I didn't know that. I've read quite a bit on King Henry VIII.
Yeah. like he killed a couple of his wives. He divorced a couple of his wives. And,
Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived.
right.
That's how you remember it. It goes in order.
It's very nice. It's poetic even. Actually, George Carlin does a great bit on Henry VIII too, but that's not the point today.
So he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon.
Yeah.
And he couldn't because he was Catholic.
Yeah. And the
Not
Pope
for
said,
long.
right? Pope said, that's not okay. And the king's like, you guys are in Italy. I'm in England. I'm going to do what I want.
I got divine right from God.
Right?
God says I can start my own religion.
And ever since that time,
Church of England.
the Church of England has been a thing. And most of the time, the monarch is looked at as the authoritative head of the church, though not actually the ecclesiastical leader of the church. That's the Archbishop
Of Canterbury. Yeah. But, and there, I mean, it flip-flopped a little bit after Henry VIII back
For
to
sure.
Catholic. But now, I mean, the Queen, Elizabeth, is still Church of England.
Yeah, that's actually one of the issues that a lot of people have with Charles taking over as king, is that he married a Catholic after his wife died. Yeah, and there's a lot of people who are super uncomfortable with him being the head of the Church of England, having married a Catholic.
Interesting.
And a lot of people are like, well, just let's send it straight to William. Okay, I don't know if that... Does it solve the problem?
It does. I mean, I would argue that William is probably a lot like most U.S. presidents and is a part of the Church of England. I'm doing air quotes.
I can say with a great and high level of certainty that William has been to church a lot more than Donald.
Oh, that's true.
How much he believes, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I've not talked to him on the subject, but
Do you want to be on our podcast, Prince William, please?
we would be very honored. Yeah. All right. Where was
We're
I?
talking about Martin Luther.
Splintering. Yeah. So Luther, Henry, once they both successfully started their own churches, more or less, I don't want to say Luther started a church, but he definitely started a church.
He started a
His
movement
efforts-
away from Catholicism.
His
If that's-
efforts led to what we know today as the Lutheran Church, which, if you're looking at how to deal with your neighbor who is Lutheran, it's basically Catholic light. It's not wildly different. It's just pretty different on a lot of little things, but
Now, my understanding of Martin Luther's biggest complaints, concerns with the church is that the priests were the gatekeepers to religion.
Yes.
Like, you needed a priest to have any sort of chance of
Yeah.
getting to heaven, and everything was still done in Latin, which very few people spoke.
yes.
And I remember hearing that some of the priests didn't even speak Latin, and they just kind of go fettuccine bikini.
Yeah, if they couldn't remember exactly what to say, or they didn't have the text to read the script, yeah, they would just spout nonsense.
And it was all about getting religion in the hands of the people, which, if you're going to do it anyway, I'm going to agree with that, I think. Empower people to
it
be...
took another 400 years for the Catholic Church to be like, maybe we should do it in the vernacular. The Vatican II is when we finally got English Mass
Oh.
as a standard thing.
And that killed Latin as a language. Nobody speaks it now.
Right? Honestly, with going through getting my bachelor's degree, I had to have language credits. And I had so many people like, you going to study Latin? No, I have no reason to study Latin. So previously to that, I had been working as a translator for the Bible. And they're like, well, you work with the Bible, so you need Latin. No. Why would I want to read the Bible in Latin? But that separates myself further from the original text, the original language. It was a problem. It's annoying. Nobody needs Latin
the original
anymore.
language of the Bible?
The New Testament was written all originally in Greek, with potentially that not being true with Matthew. An awful lot of people believe that the Gospel of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic, I guess, and then translated into Greek. But there's no evidence for that.
Because I can see the argument, which we'll talk about in our Bible episode, of things getting lost in translation, which is why absolutely you can get the Quran in different languages, but services are always done in Arabic because that's the language of the Quran. So I can see had it originally been written in Latin, that was their argument. But
the liturgy definitely would have been originally written in Latin, but that's it. I guess the papal bulls and whatnot, the ecclesiastical discourse would have happened in Latin an awful lot of the time, but probably not exclusively. So in England, they wanted the Bible in English. St. Thomas More, he was sainted, which aggravates me because the big thing that he did was kill people and burn books just because these people wanted the Bible published in English.
Oh.
He was sainted. The Catholic Church has not rescinded this. I don't think they've ever rescinded
a sainthood.
I could be wrong. I've honestly not looked it up. It's a thing that only just came to mind. But sainting St. Thomas More is a thing I'm uncomfortable with. There's actually a lot of saints I'm uncomfortable with, and we will definitely just talk about that for a whole episode one of these days, but not quite yet. And so with the success of these two groups creating their own churches or movements in Europe, and the Pope really proving powerless against them, you got a whole bunch more people. Holland and Germany and Scotland and pretty much all over Europe. People were, or Western Europe at least, English. Eastern Europe didn't really do it so much, but Western Europe really started up a whole bunch of new movements, some of which are fairly termed Protestant, and some of them feel a little separate in the way that they came to be from that label. Anabaptists are really cool.
Well, I was going to say Mennonites and Hutterites, which are part of the Anabaptist umbrella, are very interesting denominations that originated in Europe and are now very popular. I think they're almost exclusively in North America. I know they had to leave from persecution, which is why they came to North America. But yeah, that is one that seems very, to this day, very separate from mainstream Christianity.
I believe Mennonites are actually becoming more and more popular, like growing rapidly in Mexico right now, which is pretty nifty.
I have a note here that I would like you to I wrote the notes on this, but there's a lot of words I want you to explain to me. So it's the big issue in Christianity is the question of ecclesiastic authority. First of all, what is ecclesiastic authority?
I want to say it's complicated. It's not that complicated. Ecclesiastic authority is who has the power to make decisions and guide the church. And what that authority looks like is also in question. In the Orthodox tradition.
And I have Catholics, most Orthodox, and Latter-day Saints are apostolic.
Yes.
Authority. So, what is apostolic? I'm not even saying
apostolic.
Yeah. I'm like,
so
sounding it out.
For example, I worked for an Egyptian family right out of high school that I absolutely loved. And I learned from them that the church in Egypt, the Egyptian Orthodox Church, was basically founded by Saint Mark, the dude who wrote the Gospel of Mark, traveled to Egypt as a missionary, established the church as an apostle of the church, and they hold on to that authority descended from every successor who held basically the bishopric over that territory. And that's the same for an awful lot of jurisdictions out in the East. Is an apostle set up camp, send out missionaries from his camp, and basically establish the church. And Rome is the same way, with Peter being the first bishop of Rome and then Linus following. The idea is that these bishops, in a way that nobody's willing to explain in a way that satisfies me, hold apostolic authority over that city, even though they've not actually been made apostles by their predecessors. And so there's that line of authority that lots of people like to say is unbroken because they can draw you a line through names. Yay, being able to write your own history as being the person in power.
It sounds like it's a lot like the history of the British crown,
right?
where
When you can trace all the way through the British crown into the genealogies recorded in the Bible, it sounds sketchy.
But like, yeah, absolutely, you can draw a line. But at some point, there are different families and political marriages, and
at some point, there's a lie.
Well, and Elizabeth I didn't have kids, so she appointed someone new, and wars. Yeah, so that's what this sounds like to me. Where yes, you could draw a line, but it's not necessarily unbroken. There's a lot of shenanigans in there.
Right. Well, like as you mentioned, the time when we had 3 popes reigning at the same time, each fighting over the bishopric of Rome. That's not an unbroken line. Yes. It's slightly bubbly and funky and unpleasant and historically confusing sometimes. And so there's that idea of authority being received all the way through this line from the apostles. And so that is claimed by most Orthodox denominations that I'm aware of, the Catholic Church and Mormonism. Mormonism doesn't do it the same way as the Catholics and Orthodox.
Different set of apostles,
Well, there's the modern apostles and fulfill a slightly different role than Catholic and Orthodox apostles. And also there's a different narrative that there's not an unbroken 2,000 years of history. It's in the 1820...
1820s.
I'm blanking on the year. So in the 1820s, Joseph Smith reported that he had Peter, James, and John appear to him and ordain him as an elder and an apostle for the restoration of the gospel. And so we don't have a full 2,000-year history for the Latter-day Saint Apostolic Authority. We've got 200 years, which is rejected by an awful lot of Christians around the world, like the vast majority. And then there's the Protestants, who I really think is interesting. The Anglican Church pulls no punches. They will flat out call the Church of Rome apostate. Not all of them, obviously, but in plenty of official documents, that is the wording that is used.
Wow.
And that's problematic when all of your authority is derived from that heritage. You can't say that your authority is good when you denounce the source of it. It's tricky. It's very tricky. And Lutheranism is similar, but not quite the same. And then you've got your evangelicals who don't worry about authority at all.
Just whoever wants to be the next Billy Graham.
Yeah.
Can be the next Billy Graham.
Yeah. It's that easy and terrifying.
I mean, I think this is going to sound crazy coming from a Katie, but kind of falls into what Martin Luther, it's in the hands of the people. Like, why can't an average person, and arguably Jesus was an average person, become something great? Right? And that's how the Vatican picks their saints, is that these people show some higher level of religiosity that is worthy of being ordained a saint. So why do you need if you preach a good message, why do you need authority?
So different churches use that authority differently.
Fair.
Even the Catholic Church, who claims an authority on, or claims a monopoly on salvific authority, as long as you believe in Jesus, you can perform a baptism. An Anglican can perform a baptism, and the Catholic Church generally will say, yep, that kid's baptized now.
Yeah. And
they're good. They reject baptisms from a handful of churches that they're not comfortable with their theology. Catholics reject all authority claimed by Mormons for their baptisms. The wording on that's a little bit weird and fuzzy on why that's the case, and being able to defend that position when literally anybody claiming an Anglican or Lutheran or Episcopalian or Baptist faith can baptize them, and the Catholic Church says, yeah, that's cool. It's just a little bit weird to me. Whereas the Mormon Church, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you've got a very specifically delineated character of authority on who can baptize somebody. And it's cut and dry. It's easy to follow, but it's also a lot narrower than other groups. Mm-hmm. Then you've got the common evangelical position where a baptism isn't performed by somebody. You go into the water, you come out, and no one has to touch you. I'm parroting a lot what we see in Judaism with the mikveh. You go into the water, you come out, you're good. That's the deal. Whereas biblically, the baptisms that we see in the Bible, we have John the Baptist, a person with authority, baptizing another person. So that's authority is a tricky thing. What that authority does. Sometimes that authority is just the authority to teach and to lead. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's who can perform these sacraments or ordinances. And it's kind of weird. Jehovah's Witnesses, their notion of authority, as far as it relates to the priesthood, is baffling to me. I've asked, and I've not got an answer that makes sense to me enough to satisfy my question that Catholics, Orthodox, Christians, and Latter-day Saints claim authority by ordination from somebody who has got authority before them, a chain. Mm-hmm. Jehovah's Witnesses claim authority to perform Christian rites by virtue of having a Bible. Oh. Which is problematic to me. I haven't been able to make sense of it. I haven't had anybody explain it to me in a way that has made sense to me.
Anyone can do it, is what I'm hearing.
I guess. I can't defend it because I don't understand it. It's just one of those things that is odd.
So we've talked a lot about differences. Mm-hmm.
We've talked about the one thing that binds them all together.
Yep. And how they split and split and split and split. Yes, there's one thing about that binds them all together, but there are more similarities.
Absolutely.
If they're not entirely universal, there are some things that are quite common. First one I think of is Sunday as the Sabbath.
Not universal.
No, I know that. Okay. Because the Seventh-day Adventist is the first one I think of, but all of these are near universal because the only thing that's universal is Jesus is the Son of God. But this would be a very short episode if we just said
Jesus is the Son of God at the end.
Jesus is hung on a cross and we believe he's the Son of God, and that's how Christianity started, and that's the overarching.
There's actually a little detail in there that's not universal. Jehovah's Witnesses straight up deny a cross.
Oh, and no, I've heard that one too.
Yeah.
There's one where he was on just like a post, right? Yeah. But
it's so complicated,
I know,
Katie.
It's so complicated. And here we are trying to give a overarching groundwork.
We need some sort of foundation to move forward with our later discussions.
Right. But this one I think is the hardest one because there's just so much variance. So
it really is.
All these next points are near universal. So don't be emailing me saying, but we don't believe in this. Because we know. So Sabbath, near universal on Sundays. And that's because God rested. No, that's Judaism.
Yeah.
That's because Jesus was resurrected on Sunday.
Jesus rose from the dead on the 8th day.
Page is shaken. That's because Jesus was resurrected on a Sunday.
Yep. And so it's the Lord's Day.
Lord's Day.
There's actually plenty of churches that they'll have their sign up on the front of the building and to let you know when their mass is or their meetings. That's pretty standard detail.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of them will actually say, we meet on the Lord's Day, which isn't ever confusing to the people who go there, but can be confusing to people from outside that group.
And how the Sabbath is recognized is different. I imagine it's everything from similar to Judaism, where you don't do anything at all. Typically, people go to church. If you're in North America, often you go for lunch afterwards. But then,
gotta hit up that Chick-fil-A.
but some people work all day Sunday. So
There's no Chick-fil-A on Sundays. It's okay.
So how the Sabbath is recognized is different, but typically it's a church day. Unless you're a Seventh-day Adventist, in which case that's Saturday.
Yeah, there's a good bunch of Christians who have retained the ancient Sabbath rather than the renewed Sabbath.
Mm-hmm. Communion or Mass.
The emblems of the bread and the wine.
As mostly universal. I can't think of any off the top of my head that don't. It is specifically said in the Bible you should be doing this, and I don't think I can think of any that don't. I've been to church services where it hasn't happened, but I don't know if that is because it's a separate service or whatever. But I have gone to just like a regular Saturday Protestant service that didn't. But again, I don't know if that.
Yeah, there's loads of churches who don't do it every Sunday.
Don't do it.
There's some who, even if they have several meetings over the course of the week, they'll only do it on Sunday or Saturday if that's their day. Jehovah's Witnesses, if I remember correctly, only do the Eucharist on the Passover.
Oh, interesting.
So that's once a year. You've got the Latter-day Saints who will do it most Sundays, but they'll usually skip 4 or 5 Sundays in the year.
And they wouldn't do it with wine.
Right. They'll use water instead in almost every case.
Do you maybe want to talk about what the communion is? Like I don't want to assume anyone knows that it's the body and blood of Christ.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's not just a thing that showed up in the New Testament. It's a carryover from an older set of sacrifices. When you brought your lamb to be sacrificed at the altar at the temple, there was very often sacrifices accompanying that of bread and wine. And the little bit of wine would typically be poured out into the ground, as we see in a lot of religions around the world. And then it would be shared among those who are participating as well. And so Jesus said, "My blood is the wine spilt for man." And because Jesus, of course, in Christianity is that great final blood sacrifice. And then the bread, which was broken apart and offered for the good of humanity, is that body of Christ, again, sacrificed, all that. And so that tradition is perpetuated throughout Christianity for the last 2,000 years to remember that sacrifice that Jesus made. And so it's one of the handful of things that are pretty much universal among Christians, even if it's not every Sunday or Saturday for everybody.
The other one I have, and again, I can't think of a exception, is baptism. Seems pretty common. Again, the way it's done varies.
Absolutely.
But I can't think of a denomination that doesn't encourage baptism. So
yeah, the Bible is pretty clear in a few instances that Jesus tells the people, go out baptizing the people. So if you're a Christian preacher who's not telling people that they should be baptized, that would be very irregular because it doesn't mesh with what is taught in the book that you're teaching from.
So baptism can be done for infants.
That's pretty standard for the Catholic and Orthodox faiths.
Yeah. And then the other one you see often is about 11 years old. And that is so that the young person understands what the gravitas of a baptism is, and that they understand the commitments that they're making.
Absolutely. Anabaptists tend to be around puberty age.
Mm-hmm.
Latter-day Saints typically do it at 8. I'm sure there's other traditions where it's got another obscured specific age. There's plenty of churches who just say when you're an adult.
Yeah. Oh yeah, when you're ready. And then Catholics also have a celebration at 11. Your first communion.
Yeah, confirmation and first
confirmation,
communion.
yeah. And that's, I mean, it's not a baptism. You would have been baptized as an
a
infant,
child, yeah.
but that is sort of, that was like the double whammy where you have to that's where you...
and then you're really committed.
You're really committed and you understand the gravity of this choice you're making to be confirmed.
Yeah, for Latter-day Saints, the tradition that I'm pretty familiar with from a first-person point of view, that first communion is typically like a day after the baptism, and it's not really such a big deal as the baptism itself, but just one denomination's experience.
I think most Christians believe in the second coming.
I don't think, as far as I know, that's universal.
I don't think so. The idea is that Jesus was crucified. He's going to come back, restore the temple, last judgment. And, so he'll decide where we get to go. It'll be hell on earth, according to Revelations.
Yes, the revelation of John, not Revelations. There's no S on the end of that title. There's far too many Christians who get it wrong. I certainly can't blame you for not getting it right.
I was like, if I've only ever heard Revelation.
Yeah. But remember how I said an awful lot of Christians don't open the book?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's where that problem comes from.
Okay.
And, in the Revelation of John, it warns us that the world is going to get an awful lot worse before it gets better, which is pretty typical of apocalyptic literature of the era.
Perfect. So we have the second coming, and then I guess with that, again, most Christians believe in some form of heaven, and most Christians believe in some form of hell, though it is debated there's variance, and then it's also debated how you get to either one of them.
Yes.
So, but they do, I guess that's an afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you keep people in line.
Yeah, that's ultimately how it's been used for all of recorded history, is striking fear into people's hearts to control them, which is not a characteristic of love, which is kind of the primary doctrine of Christ, is to love one another. So, yay for disconnects within your logic and reasoning.
So here's a question for you,
mm-hmm.
since we have a resident Christian. How do you, and this could be you personally or the universal you, decide what you believe when there's so much variation? And as an outsider, it really feels like you could just cherry pick to...
Absolutely. I don't think that choosing what you believe is really the way it works. You can receive information and then you either believe it or you don't. And that has a lot to do with how it meshes with information you've already had up to that point. Definitely the burden of proof is ever present. And some things, what counts as evidence changes sometimes, depending on context. The word proof is actually kind of weird. There's no such thing as proof in any context other than mathematics. Everything else is evidence.
Interesting. Maybe it's not choosing what you believe. I don't know how to frame this, but it doesn't matter what you believe, you'll find it. It doesn't matter what you believe, you'll find a denomination of Christianity that jives with it.
Yeah, at the very least, you'll find a denomination of Christianity that's going to let you not change.
And isn't that a problem?
Yes.
Okay.
From the Christian perspective of there is one faith, one God, one baptism. That's the mantra. Having such a diversity of gods that you have sculpted in your own image is a huge problem. It's a complicated problem, and the trick is that you can't just convince somebody that the God that they've made up for themselves isn't real.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because if you could, then we wouldn't be a registered religion.
Right?
Fun times. This is a complicated topic. Do we have a nice summary for our listener?
I want to summarize what Christianity is supposed to be as presented in the Bible, that all of these Christians are supposed to be reading and teaching out of. That there is good news, and that's where the word gospel comes from, is that there is good news. The good news is that because Jesus died for us, we can change and have that change actually affect our outcomes after this life. It doesn't matter what I've done in the past. That doesn't make it impossible for me to actually have happiness in the next life, as long as I've changed and become better. Change is meaningful, change is possible. And because of that, we need to encourage people to be their best selves by loving them, not by forcing them to suffer under our burdens of abuse and punishment for being different. There's an awful lot of hope in the biblical Christian message, and that's true for an awful lot of religions, that there's a reason to be good, that all of the bad things that have happened around you or happened to you or happened because of you can be made to matter less, which is pretty cool.
Nice.
Yeah. But honestly, when you look at the way Christians behave towards each other, that's really easily lost.
Yeah, and towards others.
Especially towards others. I can't decide which is more unnerving, the way Christians treat people of other faiths or the way they treat each other. It's all bad. It's all disappointing.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem, and I think there needs to be some more self-policing in, probably all religions, but...
Definitely all religions. Because it's a human problem. It's not a religious problem. It's we are weak and frail, and we get self-conscious, and we need to protect ourselves. So we suck.
Yes. I think where I struggle, and this isn't really a point on Christianity necessarily, but as an atheist, it's when people behave holier than thou because of their religion, and then you're actually not. And I think that is a barrier to correction or moderation or what have you.
Absolutely.
Before we popped on, we were having a conversation about sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, and we're acting holier than thou, and the rules don't apply to you. All of a sudden, it's like there is sex abuse in the Catholic Church. It's still an issue, and it shouldn't be. They should all be in jail. I don't understand.
It's frustrating. It's deeply uncomfortable for most people to talk about, but it's a real thing, and the problem's not being fixed.
Yeah. And I guess I think sometimes religion is a hindrance to having those conversations.
Very often it is.
So, anyway, on that Debbie Downer of a note, Jesus loves you.
Yeah. Actually, I just remembered and it's slightly more positive
Oh,
note to
good.
end on,
Okay, good.
which I think is maybe why it came to mind. There's a wonderful quote by Nietzsche that God is dead, and loads of people love to just end the quote there, which is a fun way to say all these philosophers are the worst because they just are done with God. There's more to that quote. God is dead and we have killed him. And how can we be forgiven?
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh. I got chills from that.
It's kind of a weird question. And of course, he grew up in a Christian community where he is aware that Jesus died. And the story is that he came back and isn't vengeful, which is pretty cool.
I mean, it's nice of him.
Right? I mean, so many of the other gods that we have heard of in our histories definitely would have come back bearing a sword.
Or a lightning bolt.
Right?
In the form of a swan.
In the form of a swan or in the form of a swan's dick? Good old Zeus.
Why not both?
Well, that's our episode of Discussion on Christianity. Peace be with you.
Salvation for
By the late Middle Ages, the Christian prophecy had fulfilled itself.
God is